Hello and welcome to session 2 of English grammar. So today our topic is the verb phrase, and this is our first session. We're going to have 3 sessions on the verb phrase. And verbs or verbals are considered to be the most important elements in the building up of a clause or sentence. So we have a very famous Danish legendary grammarian. He was called Otto Jespersen, and he even referred to the verbals as the life-giving elements of language in his book called The Philosophy of Grammar. So this is basically what we're dealing with, and that's why we're spending 3 weeks on them. Now today we're looking at the grammatical category of verbs. We're looking at morphology, although I bet you know everything already. We're also looking at different types of verbs, including full verbs and auxiliary verbs, and we're also going to look at the non-finite forms of verbs. Now, a simple verb phrase consists of just one verb, while a complex one consists of at least 2 verbs. So in a complex verb phrase, the rightmost verb is the head or the main verb because it provides the primary communicative content, which is also known as the full verb or lexical verb, while all other verbs in the verb phrase are pre-modifying auxiliary verbs. Let's look at some examples. So here we have simple verb phrases, and you can see that we have orange verbs in all of the examples. Right, so we have long sentences here. Some of them have more than one clause, but we just have one main verb, all right, in each of the clauses. So in the first one, after all these years, Britney Spears still sucks. We have sucks there, which is the main verb, and it's finite, all right, and it has it shows verb concord with the subject, which is Britney Spears. Here are some examples of complex verb phrases. So we can see we have several orange words. So for instance, the first one, I am an evil giraffe and I shall eat all the leaves on this tree. So eat is obviously the main verb. It describes an action, and then shall is an auxiliary verb, all right, and it's also a modal verb. In this case, and we can see we can even have 3 verbs in one. So if we go to sentence E at the bottom, I could have been there, where I could have been is one complex verb phrase, and it can actually consist of 3 verbs, but it's only the final one, been, all right, that's a lexical verb. The other 2 are auxiliary verbs. Now, a complex verb phrase can also be discontinuous, and that means that basically it's split up into 2 or more parts, all right? So it's not continuous, but there are things in the middle that separates the different verbs inside the verb phrase. This is most likely going to be an adverbial, right? So here we have a couple of examples, and we can see that now we have small adverbials in between the orange verbs, okay? So had already eaten, so already is an adverb, and it sort of comes in between had, which is the auxiliary, and eaten, which is the main verb. And we can see down in C that we can actually separate a complex verb phrase into 3. So we can actually have this tiny adverbial in between each of the verbs in the verb phrase here. So Britney Spears should never be friggin' allowed to sing again. All right, so these are called discontinuous verb phrases. So the main function of verb phrases is then to describe a situation or an action, and this is in contrast to noun phrases or nominals, as we also call them. They refer to the participants in situations. So in that sense, the verb phrase provides the specific relations among the participants in the situation. And you can see how this works by carrying out what is called a commutation test. So basically you can try and insert different verbs, okay, so have, eat, buy, want, kill, into an empty slot in what we call a syntactic frame. So here we have Peter and we have an ice cream. So we just have 2 participants, right? We have 2 noun phrases, and you can make up your own examples, and then we try and put in different verbs, and we can see that obviously that changes the relation, all right, between the two participants. So you can say Peter eats an ice cream. That's fine. We can also say Peter is an ice cream. All of a sudden, this is slightly different. Or Peter kills an ice cream. All right, and we can see that obviously this completely changes the situation that is described. So that's what verbs can do. So in addition to this primary function, which is called predication, verbs cover a number of other communicative functions which are associated with a number of grammatical categories, and I'm just going to list them here, and you can also look at them in your book. That's the table in section 6.2. So they express tense, which is the location of the situation in time relative to the moment of speech. Okay, so I am talking right now. Maybe the situation took place yesterday, or really briefly before I started talking, or maybe it's going to take place tomorrow, right? So past tense, obviously, it is something that takes place in the past. Present tense, it's something that takes place right now as I'm talking, or possibly in the future. Now we can discuss the future tense in English, as some will argue that in fact this does not exist, but obviously we can still talk about the future, right? We just have different ways of doing that in English. Verbs also talk about or express aspect, and aspect refers to whether the situation expressed is complete or incomplete. So if it's perfect aspect, this typically expresses some sort of completed situation. Okay, so if I say I went to the cinema last night, then that's perfect aspect because I'm no longer at the cinema, basically. We also have something called progressive aspect, and this indicates that the situation is still happening or going on, and often we'll use the ing ending on verbs to express this. All right, so say if I am talking, it means I am talking right now. I am eating, it means I'm eating right now. And inside aspect, we also talk about mood and modality, and that expresses how real or unreal the situation is, and whether it's something we desired or whether it's something that's likely or unlikely. Now we're going to return to tense and aspect in the coming weeks, so don't worry. Verbs also express person and number because basically verbs specify the nature of the subject in terms of quantity. Okay, so that's number, so whether it's in the singular or the plural, and also quality, so whether it's the first, second or third person. And finally, verbs also express what's called voice or diathesis, and this is a little bit tricky, and it's something that we're going to be spending more time on, a lot more time later on, but it has to do with whether or not the participant who acts in the situation, so we can also call this an agent, is important enough to be the subject in the sentence, or perhaps the victim or the patient is the subject. So here we're talking about active and passive voice, and some of you might have heard about this before, these two terms. Now, as I mentioned before, the structure is such that the main verb is always to the right, and any auxiliaries appear to the left as pre-modifiers, right? So this means that this is the structure. Now, the order of the auxiliaries, okay, because we can have more than one, as we've seen. Basically, the order is fixed in complex verb phrases with more than one auxiliary in them. Okay, and that means it looks like this. So we can see at the right, towards the right, we always have the main verb. But then if we have more than one auxiliary, there is a rule to the order in which they can occur. So we can see that modal verbs, for instance, always occur first. If we then have as an auxiliary verb, that will occur in the second position. Obviously, if there is no modal verb, right, have is going to be the first one, but have will always come before main auxiliary be, for instance. Now let's look at some examples of this, right? So what it means is that modal verbs are followed by verbs in the infinitive, and we saw that, right? Because you saw it said plus infinitive. So if you just have a modal verb and then the main verb, it means that the main verb has to be in the infinitive. So in perfect aspect constructions, have is followed by a past participle. In progressive aspect constructions, be is followed by a present participle. In passive voice constructions, be is followed by a past participle. And we can obviously, as I mentioned, combine these, right? Because we can have a number of auxiliaries in one verb phrase. So I'm going to show you some examples. So here we have a modal verb plus the have auxiliary, right? Plus then the main verb. So that means that we'll get the modal, and whatever comes after must be in the infinitive. Okay, so that's have. And then whatever comes after have must be in the past participle form. So that's the main verb, which is kill in this instance, and the past participle of kill is killed, all right, with the ed ending. So that means that we get the construction may have killed. If we want the modal and be as the auxiliary, second auxiliary, then everything that comes after be is then in the present participle. So that results in the verb phrase may be killing. Okay, so the present participle is the ing form. Yeah, and we can continue. Sometimes we can also have be plus the past participle may be killed. All right, we can obviously have more. We can have the modal. We can have as the past participle, be plus present participle, and we get may have been killing. Yeah, or we can have the different form of be here. We can obviously also leave the modals out completely. So you can see they all come in the same order, and this is what's important to take away, that if you have a modal, it must come first. If you have auxiliary have, it must come after the modal and before auxiliary be. Now, this is a really useful, I think, overview of the different possibilities that you have. You have more than the one that I've shown you here, but maybe sitting down and doing something for yourself to create your own notes, so you always have this to refer to that might help you when you are conducting your sentence analyses. Now let's look at some auxiliaries then in the main verb. So the main verb describes the situation itself, basically what is happening, the action, right? And auxiliaries then add certain perspectives on it. Now here we have an example. The zombies were eating brains. So we can see that eat indicates that the situation is that of eating. Okay, this is the action that's being described. And then we have the past tense form of was, all right, because it's were, that's the past tense. So this tells us that it took place in the past. And it also tells us, okay, was, because it's followed by the present participle, eating, that the eating was still in progress, okay? So the zombies were eating, so because it's the ing ending, it's something that's going on. It's an action that's stretched over a time period, okay, at this particular point in time that I'm talking about. So these are the main auxiliaries of English, okay? So there are more auxiliaries, but these are the ones that you should definitely remember and know are auxiliaries. So have, be, do, may, must, shall, will, can. Now have, be and do are called primary verbs or primary auxiliaries because they can actually be used both as main verbs and as auxiliary verbs. That's why we sometimes say main verb be or auxiliary be, because we want to specify, all right, the function of it. Now the rest, so may, must, shall, will, can, they're modal verbs, and they are used to express various types of modality. And again, we're going to return to them at a later stage in this course. So full verbs are also divided into different classes according to the number and type of constituents they tend to appear with, and the technical term for this is transitivity or valency. So we have what we call linking verbs or copular verbs, and they appear with subject complements. So main verb be, for instance, is an example of this. We also have intransitive verbs, and they don't appear with anything apart from the subject, of course, except non-obligatory adverbials. All right, so that means that you have the subject, then you have the verb, and then you may have some adverbials sometimes, okay? So they're non-obligatory, means that they may occur or they may not. So he runs, for instance, is an example of a sentence with an intransitive verb. Then we have transitive verbs, and they require objects of some sort, okay? So usually it's going to be a direct object, but obviously it can also be different sorts, because we have what we call monotransitive verbs. They are the ones that require a direct object. All right, so he eats a cake. All right, that's just he eats. So eats here is the verb, and then we have the direct object, a cake. Now we also have ditransitive verbs. So remember that di means two, and that means that we need two objects of some sort. So in this example, we need an indirect object and a direct object. So often a verb such as giving. All right, so he gave her a ring. All right, we have the indirect object, so that's her. So she benefits from the ring. Okay, and then the direct object is the thing that's being given. We also have something called complex transitive verbs, and they are verbs that require a direct object and an object complement. So remember, these are quite rare, all right, where we have object complements, but basically they are then, well, complements, they complement the direct object. And we also have something called directional verbs. So these require a direct object and then an obligatory locative or directional adverbial. And then finally, we have something called transactional complex transitive verbs. And they require an indirect object and an adverbial which expresses the patient. Okay, so an example is, for instance, provide. If you provide somebody with something, this is an example of a transactional complex transitive verbs. Now, we also have something called multi-word verbs, and a multi-word verb consists of a full verb plus then an adverb or a preposition, which basically they're also connected in meaning, so we see them as forming a lexical unit. So often these are idioms, okay? So it means that you can't just put a different preposition after this verb, but they sort of stick together. So it's the verb consists of more than one word, right? That's why it's multi-word verbs. Now, again, we have different types. One type here, basically the phrasal verbs, and this is a construction then that consists of a verb plus an adverb. Okay, and again, these can be intransitive and transitive. So here we have some examples. So to split up, for instance, that's a phrasal verb. So to split, obviously that's a verb, and you can split a lot of things, but to split up, sort of, it means a particular type of splitting. Okay, that means it's an idiom, it's a lexical unit. You can't just say split down or something like that, and you can't just sort of exchange that adverb. So William and Kate split up. Camilla was angry because Charles got in late. So to get in, meaning coming home, that's also a phrasal verb. So these were intransitive. We also have transitive constructions. So Harry and what's her name called off the wedding. So to call off, again, that's a phrasal verb, and we can see it consists of a verb plus the adverb of. We also have prepositional verbs, and these are then verbs that have to occur with a preposition, right? So William stayed home from maybe the ball to look after the children. So to look after, obviously it's to look, right, which is the verb, but then when you look after the children or whatever, then it's this idiom. You can't just say to look. If you look for, obviously then that means something different, right? But to look after, it's a particular type of looking in a way, yeah, or to deal with something, yeah. That's the same idea. We also have phrasal prepositional verbs. So these are verbs that then are followed by both an adverb and a preposition. So if you come up with something, that's an example of that. Or if you look forward to something, right? That's another example. And then we can have other constructions, okay? So again, a verb, usually then a noun actually can occur in these lexical units, and then a preposition as well. So if you take great care of something, that's an example of one of these multi-word verb constructions, okay? Or to make allowances for. So make care the royals made allowances for Camilla. So made is the verb, all right? Allowance, that's a noun, and then for is a preposition. But how do we go about analyzing them, right? If you are asked to do a sentence analysis of a sentence that consists of one of these multi-word verbs, well, you can obviously check this out in your book, and you should do, but there are basically two different ways of going about it. One is the traditional analysis, which is you basically ignore the fact that it's a multi-word verb. You just analyze it as if it were a regular verb. So if it's this one, Charles got in late, then got, that's a verb. In, that's an adverbial. Late, adverbial. Fine, right? But if you want to show that you know that this is what we call a multi-word verb, so it's different than just your normal verb, basically you then have to say both got and in is the verb, right? So here you show that the got in basically functions as this one lexical unit, that you can't just sort of separate it, right? That you show that basically this is sort of a fixed expression, all right, that it's an idiom. Now, unfortunately, there is no fixed list of which multi-word verbs exist in English, okay? So they do often represent one meaning-bearing lexical unit, which sets them apart from just random combinations of verbs and adverbs and prepositions, okay, as you can obviously do. So thinking about the meaning is often the way to spot these fixed expressions. We also have to talk about do periphrases. We can also call it do support. That's a bit easier to say. And this is something that's needed in a range of different situations. Now, we need it if we want to negate a sentence with the adverb not. So you can say Elizabeth likes Camilla, but if you say that she doesn't like her, right, you need do. You can't just say Elizabeth likes not Camilla, or not likes Camilla, or something like that, right? We need the support from auxiliary do, all right? So Elizabeth does not like Camilla. We also use it in sentences where we have an initial restrictive or a negative adverbial. So like under no circumstances, right? So this is a negative adverbial, right? Under no circumstances. We can see it has no inside of it, right? So it's negated. Under no circumstances does she want her to be queen. We can also use do support if we want to emphasize the meaning of a lexical verb, all right? So if we actually say, well, she does want her to be queen, right? So here we emphasize the fact that, well, she wants it, she really wants it, so she does want her to be queen. We also need it in interrogative sentences, rather. Okay, so questions. Yeah, so does she want her to be queen? So here we can also note that do, which is the finite verb, here has moved to the front. Okay, and we're going to look at interrogatives and this movement at a later stage. However, we do not need do support when you already have an auxiliary. Okay, so be, have, or a modal auxiliary present, because they can carry the negation. It's only if we have a sentence that only has the main verb, then that main verb cannot carry it, okay? So then we need some sort of help. We need this do support in to carry the negation. That's a way of thinking about it, all right? But if we have an auxiliary there already, well, they can carry the negation, okay? So you can say she will not be queen, and will here is a modal verb, and that then supports the negation. So you don't have to say she will, does not be, or something like that, right? Makes no sense. So if you already have an auxiliary, then you can just stick in the negation not here, right? And that rule basically trumps all of the above rules. Yeah. That then we do not need do support. Now let's look at verb morphology. So as you know, morphology has to do with the form of words, and there are two types of morphology, as I'm sure you remember. We have inflectional morphology. Basically, these are the inflections, and we also call them conjugations when we talk about verbs, right? So if we add an S to a noun to show that it's plural, or if we add an ed morpheme to a verb to show that it's the past tense. So these are inflections. That's one kind of morphology. The other type is then derivational morphology, and that's where we derive new words from other words by adding parts to them. So if we have the morpheme ness and we add it to an adjective such as happy, we get a noun, right? Happiness. So here, because we change the word class in this instance, we can also maybe change the meaning, so either or. That means that we're dealing with derivational morphology. So verbal inflectional morphology can be quite tricky, right? So we have regular verbs. They're straightforward. That's why they're the regular ones. But there are basically four main forms that you need to know about. There's what we call the base form, and this is the verb itself with nothing added to it. Okay, so that's obviously also a morpheme in itself. Yeah, so that's the stem. Remember that. Now we can use just the base form on its own sometimes. For instance, it's also the infinitive, and sometimes we need an infinitive form of a verb, like in I like to move it. We also use it in the present tense, but obviously excluding the third person singular. So Jedi Knights carry lightsabers. So carry here is also the base form. And we also use it in the imperative, all right, which are these orders that you can sort of give to people, yeah? Like engage, for instance. And finally, we also use it in the subjunctive mood, okay? We're going to talk about the subjunctive. It's what's in Danish is called conjunctive. Okay, and you might remember this from German and stuff like that as well. But in English, we call it the subjunctive, and we also use the base form. So in the sentence, I demand that he be released. We also have something called the S form, which is used in the present tense in the third person singular, as in Simon says, clap your hands. And here we can see it because it's Simon, who's the third person singular. It's in the present tense, we need the S, right? Simon says. So this is subject-verb concord. We also have something called the ed form, which has the following functions. Both it shows past tense, so I used to love her, but I had to kill her, actually, as well. That is the example of the ed there, but look at used in this case. We also use it in the past participle, as in the example, we have landed on Mars. We have landed on Mars. And we also have the present participle, of course, or the ing form, which then covers a number of functions. So it's easy enough, right, to remember, I think, these four different forms. But of course, there are a whole bunch of irregular verbs, and they go all over the place, right? That's why we call them irregular. So some of them seem to follow certain patterns, while others are just totally idiosyncratic, all right? It means that they just do their own thing. And the only way to learn how to handle these is really to learn them by heart. Now, we need to just talk about finiteness here at the end. So when a verb phrase is finite, it means it's inflected, okay? And when it's a non-finite verb phrase, it means it's not inflected in terms of tense, number, and person. So in the case of simple verb phrases, it's quite easy because we just see it's the only verb there. But in complex verb phrases, we have to look at the very first, or the verb to the left, right? That's the one that's going to be inflected for person, number, and tense. So that's the one that's going to be finite. And in English, and this is very important, modal verbs are always finite. So when we say that modal verbs are always finite, it means that they don't have the infinitive form at all. And this makes sense because you can't really say to would or to could, right? So you can try and put the to, which is the infinitive marker, in front, and you can see that it doesn't really work. And modals are really strange because they don't occur, for instance, in the progressive or anything like that either, right? So you can't say woulding and coulding. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to look at modals in more detail later on. but just know that modal verbs are strange and that they're always finite and they only ever have this one base form. Now, non-finite forms then, what do we already know about them? Well, we know that if we say that something is non-finite, it means that they're not inflected for person, number, and tense. Okay, so we're just dealing with an infinitive, for instance, or a form, for instance, is in the ing. Okay, so we have the ing ending, and that's also a non-finite form. So they're used to form complex verb phrases. So if we say Harry and Wills were drinking, okay, here we have the example of the progressive, okay, with the ing form, and were, as we know, the finite verb is always the verb to the left. Okay, so the leftmost verb is finite and the other ones are non-finite. And here we have drinking as an example. So they're used as verbs in non-finite clauses as well. Okay, so with or without an explicit subject. So if we say Charles hoped to be king one day, okay, here we just have to be, which is the infinitive form. That's a non-finite form, to be king one day. So there is no explicit subject now. It's obviously that he himself will be king one day, right? That's what he's hoping for. But there is no explicit subject here. So non-finite forms can then be nominal. Okay, so Camilla hoped to be queen one day. They can function as an adverbial. So when dining with Elizabeth, all right, so here we have the ing form again, the progressive, and this is part of the adverbial. And finally, they can also be modifying. So Elizabeth prefers wine served in crystal glasses. So he is served in crystal glasses modifies wine. Okay, so what can we tell the listener about the wine? You can just say she prefers wine, but then there's a particular type, or we modify this even more to make it more specific. So participles may, in addition, also function as pre-modifiers in NPs. So here we have an example. Kate called a taxi for the wasted Harry. So wasted, to be wasted, all right? It actually comes from the verb waste, okay? But obviously it's a past participle, right? And we have the ed ending on it. And here it actually functions as the pre-modifier of Harry, okay? So we can say the happy Harry, the drunk Harry, or the wasted Harry. So here wasted actually is a verb form, right? So it's not an adjective, like for instance, drunk Harry. So to be drunk here is an adjective.